A former Navy SEAL thought he had only bought a cheap farmhouse that no one else wanted, but the entire town had avoided that land for years. People said the land buried a guilty memory the whole town wanted to forget forever. But the moment his German shepherd stepped onto the property, the dog began reacting strangely, as if sensing something the townspeople had tried to hide. What seemed like a simple new beginning quickly opened the door to a secret the entire town feared facing. Because sometimes the past doesn't disappear. It waits for the right person to return and uncover the truth. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe so we can continue sharing more meaningful stories with you. And now, let's begin the story. The road into Bright Hollow curled through the northern Montana hills like a pale scar cut into the earth. Late autumn light poured across the valley in long, thin bands of gold, catching on the frost that clung stubbornly to the grass and fence posts. Pine trees climbed the slopes on either side, dark and tall, their tops whispering against the cold sky. Silas Vale drove slowly. Not because the road was dangerous, though parts of it were, but because he had nowhere urgent to go anymore. The faded blue pickup rumbled beneath him, its engine steady in that patient way older machines often had. The cab smelled faintly of oil, pine sap, and the worn leather of the seat. Beside him sat Brig. The German shepherd rested upright in the passenger seat, like a quiet sentinel. He was about 6 years old, large but lean, his coat layered in cream, gray, and deep black along the spine. His ears stood erect, constantly adjusting to the sounds outside, the creak of trees, distant wind, the hum of tires on gravel. Across Brig's chest lay a working harness, matte black with a narrow trim of dark crimson along the edges. The harness had once been part of a search and rescue kit overseas. Silas had never replaced it. Some things you kept because they still worked. Others you kept because losing them would feel too much like losing the past. Silas glanced sideways at the dog. "Almost there, partner." Brig flicked one ear, but didn't move his gaze from the road ahead. Silas allowed the corner of his mouth to lift slightly. The dog had always acted as if he understood more than he probably did. The valley opened suddenly as they rounded the final bend. Bright Hollow appeared below them, small, quiet, and nestled between a wide, frozen lake and a ridge of pine-covered hills. The town looked almost too peaceful, the way places sometimes did, when they had been standing longer than most of the people living in them. A church steeple caught the sun. Smoke drifted lazily from a handful of chimneys. A single main road cut through the middle of town like a thin ribbon of dust and asphalt. Silas slowed the truck. This was it. After 20 years of war zones, temporary barracks, rented apartments, and places that never quite felt like they belonged to him, he had finally bought something that would stay. A farmhouse. Cheap. Cheap enough to make the realtor repeat the number twice, but cheap things usually had stories attached to them. Silas had learned that a long time ago. The town office sat beside the sheriff's station, a squat brick building with a wooden porch that creaked when Silas stepped onto it. Brig hopped down from the truck and followed at his side. Inside, the room smelled faintly of paper, dust, and coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. Behind a desk sat Deputy Nolan Pierce. He looked up as Silas entered. Nolan Pierce was a tall man, perhaps an inch or two taller than Silas himself. His posture was straight in that natural way some lawmen carried themselves, not stiff, just steady. His hair was dark blonde, cut short and neat at the sides. His face was long and angular, clean-shaven, with a narrow nose and sharp cheekbones that gave him a permanently thoughtful expression. His eyes were a pale gray blue, the kind of eyes that studied a man before deciding whether to trust him. Silas recognized the look instantly. Soldiers had it. Cops did too. "You must be Vale," Nolan said. His voice was calm, measured. Silas nodded once. "Silas Vale." Nolan's gaze drifted briefly toward Brig. The dog stood quietly beside Silas, watching the room with alert curiosity, but no aggression. "Well," Nolan said, leaning back slightly in his chair, "not every day someone buys the old farm up on North Ridge." Silas waited. Years of military life had taught him something useful about conversations. Silence often made people speak more than they planned. Nolan sighed faintly and slid a folder across the desk. "Taxes were overdue for nearly 5 years, he said. Property technically fell under county lien. Previous owner's relatives never came back for it." Silas flipped through the documents. Everything looked exactly the way the realtor had described it. Legal, abandoned, cheap. But Nolan hadn't looked away yet. "You know why it's cheap?" the deputy asked. Silas closed the folder. "I assumed there was a story." Nolan studied him for a moment longer. Then he nodded once. "Every town's got a place people don't like to talk about." His tone wasn't threatening, just honest. Silas had heard worse explanations. Outside, the air carried the clean bite of northern cold. Brig trotted ahead, nose low to the ground, investigating the edge of the gravel lot. His movements were controlled and purposeful, years of training shaping every step. Silas leaned against the truck and looked across the small town. A diner sat on the corner. A hardware store across the road. A mechanic's garage farther down. A few people moved along the sidewalks, bundled in jackets against the wind. Most of them noticed him, and most of them looked away a moment later. Silas had expected that too. Small towns worked differently from cities. They didn't ignore strangers. They measured them. Brig returned and sat beside him. The dog's amber-brown eyes lifted toward Silas briefly. "What do you think?" Silas murmured. Brig huffed softly. Silas chuckled under his breath. "Yeah," he said. "Figured you'd say that." The farmhouse sat on the northern edge of town. A dirt road wound upward through tall grass and scattered pine until the land opened into a wide, quiet clearing. The house stood there alone. It was larger than Silas expected, though age had bent it slightly. The wooden siding had faded to a pale gray. A portion of the porch sagged on one side, and the barn behind the house leaned like a tired old soldier. But the land was beautiful. An orchard of old apple trees stretched along the hill. A narrow creek shimmered in the distance. Mountains rose blue and silent beyond the valley. Silas stepped out slowly. Wind brushed across the clearing, carrying the scent of pine and cold water. For a long moment he said nothing. Then Brig moved. The dog circled the yard carefully, nose working the ground in wide loops. Training. Instinct. Memory. Silas watched him with quiet interest. Brig stopped near the porch. The shepherd lowered his head, sniffed the wooden boards, then stepped back and looked at Silas. Not alarmed, just attentive. Silas walked over. The wood beneath his boots creaked softly. He ran a hand across the railing. Weathered. Solid. "Not bad," he murmured. The house felt older than the papers suggested. Older in the way places sometimes did. like they had absorbed the lives of the people who passed through them. Brigg suddenly lifted his head. His ears turned sharply toward the tree line. Silas followed the movement. Nothing, just wind brushing through the branches. The dog stayed still for several seconds. Then he relaxed. Silas frowned slightly. Brigg rarely reacted without reason, but whatever had caught the dog's attention was gone now. Silas pushed the thought aside and opened the front door. The inside of the farmhouse smelled like dust and cold wood. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows, lighting the floating particles in the air. The living room was mostly empty, except for an old stone fireplace and a long wooden table. Silas set his duffel bag down. The quiet pressed against the walls in that strange way old houses sometimes carried, silence, thick, almost listening. Brigg padded slowly across the floor, claws clicking softly. He sniffed along the walls. Then the staircase. Then the kitchen doorway. His tail moved slowly, thoughtful rather than excited. Silas watched him for a moment. The dog's reactions mattered. Brigg had spent years detecting explosives, hidden spaces, and people trapped beneath rubble. A trained dog noticed things humans missed. Still, Silas exhaled slowly. "You like it?" he asked. Brigg glanced back at him. Then, without warning, the shepherd walked into the center of the room and sat down, directly facing the front door. Alert. Waiting. Silas felt something stir in his chest. Not fear. Not exactly curiosity either. Just the faint sensation that the house had shifted somehow, now that they were inside. Like a room that had been holding its breath. Silas rubbed the back of his neck and gave a quiet laugh. "Guess that makes two of us," he said. Because for the first time in years, he had the odd feeling that he wasn't just standing in a house he bought. He was standing in a place that had been waiting. Morning arrived quietly over Bright Hollow. The first light crept over the mountains like pale smoke, touching the frozen grass outside the farmhouse and turning each blade into a thin shard of gold. The air carried that sharp northern chill that woke the lungs immediately, the kind that reminded a man he was alive, whether he wanted the reminder or not. Silas Vale stood on the front porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming his hands. The farmhouse looked different in daylight, less mysterious, more honest. Every flaw was now visible. The sag in the porch rail, the faded paint peeling from the siding, the barn roof that dipped slightly in the middle. But none of it frightened him. If anything, the imperfections made the place feel real. Behind him, Brigg padded quietly out the front door. The German shepherd stretched long and slow, his muscles tightening under the layered coat of cream, gray, and black fur. His harness, the same black working harness with the thin red trim, shifted slightly across his shoulders as he moved. Then he shook himself, ears flicking. Silas glanced down at him. "Morning inspection?" Brigg gave a soft huff and trotted across the yard. His nose lowered immediately to the ground. The dog moved with deliberate patience, tracing invisible trails through the frost. Years of search and rescue training had shaped that behavior into instinct. Silas watched him work. It reminded him of mornings overseas K9 units checking abandoned buildings before soldiers stepped inside. Those memories were quieter now than they used to be, but they never disappeared completely. He took another sip of coffee and looked toward the town below. Bright Hollow sat in the valley like it had always belonged there, and Silas wondered something he hadn't allowed himself to think the night before. Would they ever see him as part of it? By mid-morning, he drove down into town. The old pickup rumbled along the dirt road, tires crunching over frost. Brigg sat upright in the passenger seat again, watching the landscape pass by. The town was more alive now. A few trucks rolled down Main Street. Someone swept the sidewalk outside a small grocery store. The diner on the corner released the warm smell of bacon and coffee into the cold air. Silas parked near the hardware store. The bell above the door chimed when he stepped inside. A man behind the counter looked up. He was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered but softened by years of standing behind that counter rather than working a field. His beard was thick and gray at the edges, trimmed short along his jaw. His hair had receded enough that a shiny patch of scalp caught the light above his forehead. His name tag read Carl. Carl's eyes moved first to Silas, then to Brigg. The shepherd walked calmly beside Silas, tail relaxed but alert. "Dog's well behaved," Carl said. His voice was gravelly, but not unfriendly. "Former search and rescue," Silas replied. Carl nodded slowly. "That explains it." The man didn't ask more questions. Small towns often respected silence as much as conversation. Silas gathered a few supplies, wood screws, nails, a small pry bar. Carl rang them up while studying him in that casual, sideways way people did when they were trying to learn about someone without asking. "You're the one who bought the North Ridge farm," Carl said finally. Silas nodded once. Carl leaned on the counter slightly. "Been empty a long time." There was no accusation in his voice, just the quiet weight of history. Silas paid, thanked him, and stepped back into the cold air. Down the street sat the diner. The sign above the door read Bell's Kitchen. Silas hesitated only a moment before walking inside. Warm air wrapped around him immediately. The diner smelled like coffee, toasted bread, and something frying in butter. The place was simple but comfortable wood booths, a long counter, and sunlight pouring through wide windows. Behind the counter stood Mara Bell. She noticed Silas the moment he walked in. Mara was a tall woman, perhaps around 40, with a slim build that spoke more of endurance than fragility. Her hair was a deep chestnut brown, threaded lightly with strands of honey-colored highlights, tied loosely at the back of her neck. A few stray pieces had escaped and framed her face. Her skin carried the pale tone common in northern climates, though years of early mornings and long workdays had left faint lines at the corners of her eyes. Those eyes were a warm hazel green, sharp, observant. She wiped her hands on a blue-gray apron and walked over. "You must be the new neighbor up the ridge," she said. Her voice held the calm confidence of someone used to speaking to strangers every day. Silas nodded slightly. "Silas Vale." Mara extended her hand. Her grip was firm. "Mara Bell." Her gaze shifted briefly toward Brigg, who had taken a seat beside Silas without being told. "Well," she said, her expression softening slightly. "Anyone who keeps a dog like that is usually decent company." Silas allowed the faintest smile. They sat near the window. Mara poured him coffee and set a plate of eggs and toast down in front of him. For a while, they spoke little, but silence in diners was different from silence in empty houses. This one felt normal. Outside, the town moved slowly through its morning routines. Silas noticed people looking through the window occasionally. Not hostile, just curious. Mara noticed it too. "Small town," she said quietly. "News travels fast." Silas took a sip of coffee. "I figured." She studied him for a moment. Then she said something that surprised him. People here aren't unfriendly, she said. Just careful. Silas waited. Mara leaned lightly against the counter. That farmhouse you bought, she continued. It reminds folks of something they wish had gone differently. She didn't explain further, but her tone carried enough meaning. Silas nodded slowly. I've lived in places like that before. Mara seemed to understand what he meant. War zones had their own haunted buildings, too. After lunch, Silas stepped outside again. The sky had turned a brighter blue now, the sun cutting through the cold air. Brigg moved beside him calmly. They walked a short distance down the street. A mechanic's garage stood near the edge of town. The open bay door revealed a man leaning under the hood of a truck. He looked up as Silas approached. This was Owen Pike. Owen was younger than Silas, probably around 30. His build was solid and broad through the shoulders, the kind of strength that came from lifting engines rather than weights. His hair was light brown, messy from constantly pushing it back with oil-stained hands. His jaw was square, his nose slightly crooked, likely broken at some point. Grease smudged across his cheek. His eyes, however, were sharp amber brown. The eyes of someone who had learned early not to trust easily. "You the new guy?" Owen asked. His tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't welcoming either. Silas nodded. "Bought the farm." Owen wiped his hands on a rag. "That's so." He studied Brigg briefly. Then Silas. Owen gave a small shrug. "Well," he said, turning back to the engine. "Hope you like cold winters." It wasn't an insult, just a fact. Silas respected that. They walked back toward the truck, but as they passed a narrow side street, Brigg suddenly stopped. The dog's body stiffened. His ears snapped forward. Silas noticed immediately. Brigg had detected something. A scent. Or a sound. The shepherd took a few slow steps toward a small wooden fence that bordered an empty yard. Silas followed. The yard itself was quiet. Nothing moved. But Brigg lowered his head, sniffing along the ground near the fence line. Then he froze. Brigg sat down. Slowly, deliberately, facing the old farmhouse road that led back toward North Ridge. His amber eyes lifted to Silas. And for a moment, just a moment, the dog gave a low, uncertain whine. Not fear. Not aggression. Something closer to recognition. Silas felt a faint tightening in his chest. Brigg rarely reacted that way without reason. But when Silas followed the direction of the dog's gaze, the road was empty. Just wind brushing dust across the gravel. Silas crouched beside him. "What is it, partner?" Brigg didn't move. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the tension left the dog's body. He stood, shook himself, and walked calmly back toward the truck. Silas watched him go. His instincts told him the moment meant something. But he had learned long ago that answers rarely arrived the same day questions appeared. So he stood, brushed dust from his hands, and followed Brigadier. By late afternoon, the valley light softened again. Silas drove back up North Ridge. The farmhouse waited where he had left it. Quiet. "Patient?" Brigg jumped from the truck and trotted ahead. Silas followed more slowly. He stopped halfway across the yard. The wind moved through the apple trees, making the branches creak softly. For the first time that day, the place didn't feel like an empty property. It felt like a beginning. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet, stubborn kind. Silas rested his hands on his hips and studied the house again. "All right," he muttered to himself. "Let's see what we can fix." Behind him, Brig sat near the porch, watching, waiting, like a soldier standing post beside a campfire at the edge of unfamiliar land. And somewhere deep inside Silas Vale, something old and restless shifted slightly toward something steadier. Not belonging. Not yet. But perhaps the first step toward it. Morning in Bright Hollow carried the quiet weight of early winter. The sky was a pale, endless blue. Thin clouds stretched across it like worn linen. Sunlight spilled gently across the valley, touching the frozen surface of the lake and scattering small flashes of white light across the water's skin. Silas Vale stepped out of the farmhouse with a tool belt around his waist. The porch boards creaked beneath his boots as he moved toward the yard, carrying a small bundle of lumber he'd picked up from Carl's store the day before. The farmhouse needed work, lots of it. The railing leaned dangerously on the western side, the barn doors hung crooked, and the orchard fence had collapsed in several places. But none of that bothered Silas. After years of temporary barracks and rented rooms that never felt permanent, the idea of fixing something that would stay put felt strangely satisfying. Behind him, Brig trotted across the frost-covered grass. The German shepherd's coat glimmered faintly in the cold sunlight, cream and gray, blending into the darker stripey along his back. His black harness with the thin red trim rested snug against his shoulders as he moved. The dog paused at the edge of the yard and scanned the open land. Alert. Always alert. Silas set the lumber down and stretched his shoulders. The cold bit gently into his lungs when he inhaled. It felt good. "All right," he murmured to Brig. "Let's get some work done." By midday, the porch railing stood straighter. Silas wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold air. He stepped back to study the repair. Not perfect, but solid. Brig watched from the shade of an apple tree, ears turning occasionally toward the distant sounds drifting up from the town. Cars, voices, laughter. Bright Hollow seemed more alive today. Silas checked his watch. Late morning. He remembered something Mara had mentioned at the diner. A small weekend market near the lake. He considered staying and working. Then he looked at Brig. The dog's tail thumped once against the frozen grass. Silas sighed. "All right," he said quietly. "We'll take a break." The lake lay just beyond the southern edge of town. Bright Hollow's weekend market spread across a clearing near the shoreline wooden stalls, folding tables, and a scattering of food trucks. The air smelled like roasted corn, maple pastries, and hot coffee. Families walked between the stalls, bundled in coats and scarves. Children ran across the snow-dusted grass. The scene carried a warmth that felt almost fragile against the cold wind blowing down from the mountains. Silas parked the truck along the edge of the road. Brig jumped down beside him. The dog moved calmly through the crowd, staying close to Silas's leg. People noticed him. Some smiled. Others simply watched. German shepherds had a way of drawing attention. Silas kept his hands in his pockets and walked slowly through the stalls. At one booth, a tall man handed out cups of apple cider. At another, a woman sold knitted scarves. Bright Hollow felt different here, less guarded, more human. Then Silas heard a familiar voice. "Well," Maribel said from behind a stall stacked with homemade bread. "Looks like you found the town gathering?" She stood behind the table in a thick wool sweater and her usual apron. Her chestnut hair had been tied into a loose braid that hung over her shoulder. The sunlight caught the faint golden tones in it. "You weren't kidding about the market," Silas said. Mara smiled slightly. "It's the one day everyone pretends winter doesn't exist." She reached down and held out a piece of bread toward Brig. The shepherd accepted it carefully. "He's polite," Mara noted. "Better manners than most soldiers I knew." Silas chuckled quietly. "He's had better training." Mara studied him for a moment. "You starting to like it here yet?" Silas looked across the market. Children chasing each other near the ice, smoke rising from food stalls, the lake reflecting the sky. "Still deciding," he said. Mara nodded. "Fair answer." Silas wandered closer to the shoreline. The lake stretched wide and silent beneath the sky, its surface frozen in places where the water had grown shallow near the edges. Children had begun playing on a section of thin ice near the dock. Silas watched them automatically. Years of training had left certain instincts behind. One of them was noticing risk. The ice looked fragile. Too fragile. He glanced toward the adults nearby. Most were distracted by conversation. Silas frowned slightly. Brig suddenly stopped walking. The dog's ears snapped upright, his body stiffened. Silas noticed immediately. "What is it?" Brig's gaze locked on the ice. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, had wandered farther out than the others. The ice beneath him gave a faint crack. Silas felt the sound more than heard it. Training kicked in before thought could interfere. "Hey!" he shouted. The boy turned. The ice split. The child vanished beneath the surface. The world exploded into chaos. Parents screamed. Children ran back toward shore. Silas was already moving. He threw off his jacket and dropped flat onto the ice, spreading his weight. "Call 911!" someone shouted behind him. Brig barked sharply from the shoreline, pacing along the edge. Silas crawled forward slowly. Every inch mattered. The hole in the ice churned with dark water. Then a small hand broke the surface. Silas lunged. His grip caught the boy's sleeve. The child's weight nearly pulled him forward into the freezing water. "Hold on!" Silas barked. He dug his boots into the ice and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then 2 men ran out with a rope. One of them was Deputy Nolan Pierce. Nolan dropped to his knees and grabbed the rope's end. "On 3!" They pulled together. The boy slid across the ice and into Nolan's arms. A woman rushed forward, sobbing, and wrapped the child in a blanket. Silas rolled onto his back, breathing hard. Above him, the sky looked impossibly blue. Brig barked again and ran toward him. The dog's paws skidded across the ice before he reached Silas's side. The shepherd nudged his shoulder, whining softly. "I'm good," Silas murmured. As Silas sat up, catching his breath, Brig suddenly turned his head. Not toward the crowd, not toward the lake, but toward the far side of the shoreline. His gaze fixed on something beyond the trees. For several long seconds, the dog didn't blink. The fur along his neck lifted slightly. Silas followed his line of sight. But the tree line stood empty. Wind rustled through the branches. Nothing moved. Then Brig blinked once, and the tension vanished. He lowered his ears and sat beside Silas again, as if nothing had happened. But the moment lingered, like a whisper that hadn't quite reached words. The boy's mother approached Silas a few minutes later. She was pale, shaking. Her dark hair stuck to her cheeks where tears had frozen in the cold. "Thank you," she said. Her voice cracked. Silas nodded. "No problem." Nolan helped the boy into an ambulance that had just arrived. When the siren faded into the distance, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Silas stood and brushed ice from his jeans. Nolan walked over. "You handled that like you've done it before," the deputy said. Silas shrugged. "Similar situations?" Nolan studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. "Well," he said quietly. Bright Hollow owes you one. Silas didn't respond. He didn't do things like that for gratitude. But as he walked back toward the truck, something felt different. People weren't looking at him the same way anymore. Not with suspicion, not entirely. Some nodded, others smiled. Even Owen Pike raised a hand briefly from across the parking lot. Silas opened the truck door. Brigg jumped inside. Silas paused before climbing in. He looked once more across the lake. The ice had already begun to refreeze around the broken hole, nature repairing itself quietly. Silas turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled to life. "Let's go home," he said. Brigg settled into the passenger seat, and as the truck rolled back toward North Ridge, the valley behind them seemed just a little less distant than it had that morning. The wind began before dawn. It crept down from the northern ridges sometime in the dark hours, whispering through the tall pines that surrounded Silas Vale's farmhouse. At first it sounded harmless, almost like the quiet rustling of distant waves. But by the time the first thin gray light reached the valley, the wind had grown teeth. Silas woke to the sound of it pushing against the walls. The farmhouse groaned softly in protest. He lay still for a moment on the narrow bed in the living room, staring at the ceiling beams. Years of living in unpredictable places had trained him to recognize weather by sound alone. This was no ordinary wind. Outside, something metallic clattered. Brigg lifted his head immediately. The German shepherd had been sleeping near the fireplace, curled in a tight circle, with his black harness still strapped loosely around his chest. Now his ears stood upright, every muscle alert. Silas swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Yeah," he muttered. "I hear it too." He pulled on his boots and stepped outside. Cold air struck him like a slap. The sky was dark, with thick clouds moving fast across the mountains. Wind tore across the open field, bending the old apple trees and sending loose branches tumbling across the frozen grass. The barn roof creaked dangerously. Silas walked the perimeter of the house quickly, checking the repairs he had made earlier in the week. The porch railing held. The windows rattled but stayed intact. Brigg ran ahead, nose lifted into the wind. The dog moved differently during storms, more focused, more purposeful, as if the shifting air carried thousands of scents at once. Silas finished checking the barn door and stepped back toward the house. The storm was only getting stronger, and something about it reminded him of Afghanistan. The sudden violence of it, the way quiet landscapes could turn dangerous in minutes. Silas shook the thought away. This wasn't war, just weather. By mid-morning, the wind had turned fierce. Power lines somewhere down in the valley snapped with a faint popping sound that echoed through the hills. Silas noticed the lights flicker once inside the farmhouse. Then they went out completely. He stood in the doorway, watching the storm push snow sideways across the valley floor. Bright Hollow lay several miles below. Even from this distance, he could see that the town was struggling. A few rooftops had already lost loose shingles. Branches littered the roads. Silas glanced down at Brigg. The dog was staring toward town. His ears twitched again. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" Silas asked quietly. Brigg wagged his tail once. Silas sighed. So much for a quiet day. The drive down North Ridge took longer than usual. The dirt road had turned slick under drifting snow and broken twigs. Silas drove slowly, the old pickup's engine rumbling steadily while gusts of wind pushed against the truck's side. By the time he reached Bright Hollow, the storm had transformed the town. A large pine had collapsed across part of the road near the mechanic's garage. Owen Pike stood beside it. He wore a thick flannel jacket and heavy gloves, his light brown hair whipping wildly in the wind. Grease stains still marked his sleeves from earlier work, though now his face carried more concern than irritation. He spotted Silas's truck and waved. Silas pulled over and stepped out. The cold wind bit immediately. "Morning," Owen shouted over the storm. Silas looked at the fallen tree. "Looks like you've got company." Owen snorted. "Storm decided we needed landscaping." The younger man had always carried an edge to his personality, direct, blunt, and skeptical of strangers. But today there was something else in his tone. Relief. Silas grabbed a chainsaw from the truck bed. "Let's move it." Owen nodded once. Together they cut the pine into manageable sections while the wind howled around them. Sawdust mixed with snowflakes in the air, turning the scene into a blur of white and pale yellow. By the time the road cleared, both men were breathing heavily. Owen leaned against the truck fender. "Didn't think you'd come down here in this weather," he admitted. Silas shrugged. "Town looked like it needed help." Owen studied him briefly. Then he nodded again. A small gesture, but genuine. Silas spent the next hour moving through town. He helped a delivery driver pull a van out of a snowbank. He hammered loose boards back onto the grocery store's side wall. He carried firewood into a small house near the edge of town, where an elderly resident had lost electricity. Bright Hollow had shifted from suspicion to quiet cooperation. People spoke to him now. Not much, but enough. Briggs stayed close throughout it all. The shepherd moved like a silent assistant alert, steady, occasionally nudging tools or stepping around obstacles with uncanny awareness. Silas finished stacking wood outside the small white house and wiped his hands. Inside lived Ruth Alder. The door opened before he knocked. Ruth was small and thin, her posture slightly bent with age, but her movements precise. Her hair was a soft, silver gray, cut short in a practical style that framed her lined face. Despite the years etched across her skin, her eyes were sharp and clear. The eyes of someone who had spent decades watching people carefully. "You must be the man who bought the farmhouse," she said. Her voice carried the calm authority of a retired schoolteacher. Silas nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Ruth glanced at Brig. The dog sat politely beside Silas, tail resting against the porch boards. "Well," Ruth said after a moment, "anyone trusted by a dog like that can't be entirely foolish." Silas smiled faintly. "High praise." She stepped aside. "You'd better come in before the wind decides to carry you off." Inside, the house smelled of tea and old books. Ruth poured 2 cups while the storm rattled the windows. "You've been busy today," she said. Silas shrugged. "Just lending a hand." Ruth stirred her tea slowly. "This town remembers kindness," she said, "even if it takes time." Silas considered that. He wondered if she meant the present or the past. As Silas finished his tea, Brig suddenly stood up. The shepherd walked slowly across the room toward the back wall. His nose pressed against the wood paneling. Then he scratched. Once. Twice. Not aggressively, just deliberately. Silas frowned. "What is it?" Brig stepped back and looked at him. Ruth watched the dog with quiet curiosity. "Well," she said softly, "that's interesting." Silas crouched beside the wall. He tapped the wood. The sound echoed hollow. Ruth's eyebrows lifted slightly. "That panel wasn't always there," she murmured. Silas felt a strange ripple of curiosity pass through him. The storm roared outside the house. But inside that quiet living room, Brig sat calmly beside the wall, as if waiting for someone to notice something that had been hidden for a very long time. Silas eventually stood again. The storm was easing slightly outside. He knew the town would need more help before nightfall. Ruth walked him to the door. "You'll come back and look at that later," she said. It wasn't a question. Silas nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am." Outside, the wind had begun to lose its fury. Snow still drifted across the road, but the worst of the storm had passed. Silas climbed back into his truck. Brig jumped into the passenger seat. As the engine started, Silas glanced toward Ruth's house one last time. Bright Hollow had survived the storm. And somehow, so had something else. Something older. Something hidden quietly behind walls and memories. Silas drove back toward Northridge. The farmhouse waited on the hill above the valley. And for the first time since arriving, Silas felt the faint stirring of something unexpected. Not just responsibility, not just curiosity, but the sense that Bright Hollow was slowly opening its story to him, one piece at a time. The storm passed during the night. Morning in Bright Hollow arrived with the quiet clarity that only follows violent weather. Snow lay scattered across the valley in uneven patches. Broken branches dotted the roadside, and the sky stretched wide and pale above the mountains, as if nothing dramatic had happened at all. Silas Vale stood outside the farmhouse, breathing slowly. Cold air filled his lungs, crisp and sharp. He rested one hand on the porch railing he had repaired earlier in the week. The wood was still solid, despite the wind that had torn through the valley the day before. The storm had tested the house, and it had held. Behind him, Brig emerged from the doorway. The German shepherd stepped down onto the frost-covered boards with a quiet confidence that had become part of Silas's daily rhythm. His coat layers of cream, gray, and black caught the morning light as he stretched his front legs and yawned. The black harness with its thin red trim still rested around his shoulders. Silas scratched behind the dog's ear. "Looks like we survived," he murmured. Brig wagged his tail once. The shepherd then turned his head toward the road, leading down into Bright Hollow. Silas noticed the movement. "You thinking about town again?" Brig gave a soft huff. Silas smiled faintly. "Yeah," he said. "Me too." The valley looked different after the storm. Debris still cluttered the roads in places, but people had already begun the quiet work of rebuilding small damages. That was the thing about towns like Bright Hollow. They didn't panic. They fixed things. Silas drove slowly into town, the pickup crunching over bits of broken branches along the dirt road. Brig sat beside him, watching the landscape. When they reached the center of town, Silas noticed something unusual. Several people stood gathered outside the small town hall. Their voices were low, serious. Deputy Nolan Pierce stood among them, speaking quietly with Mara Bell and Owen Pike. Silas parked nearby and stepped out. The conversation paused when he approached. Not uncomfortably, just cautiously. Nolan nodded. "Morning." "Morning," Silas replied. Mara folded her arms against the cold. The tall woman looked tired from the storm cleanup, though her sharp hazel-green eyes still carried that steady confidence he'd seen before. "We were just talking about the farm," she said. Silas raised an eyebrow slightly. "My farm?" Owen Pike leaned against a truck nearby. His flannel jacket was dusted with sawdust and dirt from clearing debris earlier that morning. The younger man's messy light brown hair stuck up unevenly from under a wool cap. Not exactly your farm, Owen said. He gestured toward an elderly man standing near the edge of the group. Silas hadn't noticed him before. The old man stood with a weathered cane planted in the ground beside him. His coat was thick and forest green, the kind worn by people who had spent decades outdoors in northern climates. His name was Walter Green. Walter was well into his 70s, maybe older. His body had thinned with age, but his posture remained stubbornly upright. A narrow face framed by thin silver hair gave him the look of someone carved from the same wood as the forests surrounding Bright Hollow. But it was his eyes that caught Silas's attention. They were pale gray and sharp, the kind of eyes that had watched a lot of years pass. Walter studied Silas quietly. "You're the one living up on North Ridge now," the old man said. His voice carried the slow, deliberate cadence of someone who chose words carefully. Silas nodded. "That's right." Walter shifted his cane slightly. "I used to patrol those woods." Silas tilted his head. "Park ranger?" Walter gave a small smile. "Forest Service. 32 years." There was pride in his voice. But something else, too. Something quieter. Regret. They moved inside the town hall to escape the wind. The building smelled faintly of paper, wood polish, and the lingering dampness left behind by people coming in from the snow. Walter sat slowly at a wooden table. Silas noticed the way the old man's hands trembled slightly as he removed his gloves. Age, but also nerves. The room grew quiet. Walter looked at Silas again. "You found anything unusual in that farmhouse yet?" he asked. Silas thought for a moment. "Depends on what counts as unusual." Walter nodded slowly. "That place holds a lot of history." Owen leaned against the wall nearby. "Most of it bad," he muttered. Mara shot him a quick look. "Let him talk." Walter rubbed his hands together slowly, as if warming them near an invisible fire. "There was a family who lived there," he said. "A long time ago." His voice softened slightly. "They were good people." Silas waited. Walter exhaled slowly. "The town didn't always treat them that way." Walter paused mid-sentence. His pale gray eyes drifted toward Brig. The German shepherd sat beside Silas's chair, watching the room calmly. For several seconds, Walter simply stared at the dog. Then he leaned forward slightly. "That dog," he said quietly. Silas frowned. "What about him?" Walter shook his head slowly. "Strange thing," he murmured. "I used to see a dog like that around the farmhouse years ago." The room fell silent. Owen straightened slightly. Mara blinked. Silas felt a faint chill run along the back of his neck. Walter studied Brig again. "Same posture," he said. "Same way of watching people." Brig tilted his head slightly. The old ranger exhaled. "Maybe coincidence," he said. But his voice carried a note of uncertainty, and something deeper, something like memory. Walter continued speaking after a moment. "The family that lived there, they asked the town for help during a bad winter," he said. "Storms worse than the one yesterday." He looked around the room. Nobody came. The words settled heavily into the quiet hall. Mara lowered her gaze. Owen rubbed the back of his neck. Walter continued. "People had their reasons," he said. "Arguments about land, rumors, pride." He sighed. "But reasons don't change the outcome." Silas studied the old man. "You were there," he said. Walter nodded. "I was young then." His voice grew distant, I remember standing in town when someone mentioned the farm needed help. He paused. I should have gone. Silas understood that kind of sentence. Soldiers spoke it all the time. I should have gone. I should have been there. Walter's hand tightened around the cane. By the time anyone checked on them, it was too late. The room stayed quiet, not uncomfortable, just heavy with truth. Walter finally looked directly at Silas. You living there now means something, he said. Silas frowned slightly. I just bought a cheap house. Walter shook his head. No, he said softly. You bought a place the town has been trying to forget for 20 years. The meeting ended slowly. People drifted out of the hall one by one. Outside, the sun had begun to break through the clouds, casting long streaks of light across the valley. Silas stood beside his truck. Brigg jumped into the passenger seat. Walter approached him slowly. The old ranger leaned lightly on his cane. You planning to stay up there? He asked. Silas considered the question. For a while. Walter nodded. That land is worth protecting. Silas looked toward the hills above town. The farmhouse waited somewhere beyond them. I'm starting to think so too. Walter smiled faintly. Then he turned and walked slowly down the street. Silas climbed into the truck. The engine started with its familiar rumble. Brigg rested his head against the door, watching the road. As Silas drove back toward North Ridge, the mountains stood silent above the valley. Bright Hollow looked peaceful again. But Silas now understood something important. The farmhouse wasn't just abandoned property. It was unfinished history. And somehow, without meaning to, he had stepped directly into the middle of it. The valley had turned quieter again. 3 days had passed since the storm, and Bright Hollow seemed to breathe more easily now. Broken branches had been cleared from the roads, roofs patched with temporary boards, and the town's electrical lines restored. The mountains surrounding the valley stood silent and watchful, their peaks still dusted with fresh snow. Silas Vale stood beside the orchard fence, behind his farmhouse. The morning air smelled faintly of wet wood and thawing earth. Winter had not fully arrived yet, but the land carried the heavy stillness that came just before it did. Silas rested his arms on the top rail of the fence. Below the hill, Bright Hollow looked peaceful again. Smoke drifted from chimneys. Cars moved slowly along the main road. The town had returned to its rhythm. Behind him, Brigg moved quietly through the orchard rows. The German shepherd's paws crunched softly over the frozen grass as he inspected the land. His cream-gray-black coat blended easily with the winter colors of the valley, and the red-edged harness across his chest flashed briefly in the morning light when he turned. The dog paused near one of the older apple trees. He sniffed the trunk carefully, then looked back toward Silas. Silas smiled faintly. You approve? Brigg wagged his tail once. Silas exhaled slowly. For the first time since arriving, the farmhouse felt less like borrowed space, more like a place where he might stay. Later that afternoon, the quiet was broken by the sound of engines. Silas heard the trucks before he saw them. 2 dark SUVs climbed the dirt road toward North Ridge, their tires pushing gravel aside as they approached the farmhouse. Brigg noticed immediately. The shepherd trotted toward the front yard, ears raised high. Silas walked out onto the porch. The vehicle stopped near the gate. The doors opened. 3 men stepped out. The first man approached with confident, measured steps. His name was Harold Finch. Harold Finch looked like someone who belonged in a city boardroom rather than standing in the cold dirt of rural Montana. He was tall and lean, probably in his late 40s, with neatly combed blonde hair that showed no trace of wind or weather. His overcoat was dark and expensive, its clean lines standing in sharp contrast to the worn fences and weathered barn around the farmhouse. His face was smooth and controlled, his smile polite but distant, the kind of smile that never quite reached the eyes. Those eyes were a cold steel blue. Calculating. Behind him walked a younger man carrying a leather briefcase. The assistant was introduced a moment later as Tom Rivers. Tom looked to be in his early 30s, slender and slightly nervous. His dark hair was combed carefully to one side, and his glasses slid down his nose every few minutes as he adjusted them. Unlike Finch, Tom's coat already showed signs of discomfort with the rural environment. Dust clung to the sleeves, and he kept glancing down at his shoes as if worried about the mud. Finch extended his hand. "Mr. Vale." Silas shook it. "Silas." Finch nodded politely. "I'm Harold Finch, Northridge Mining." Silas felt Brigg step closer beside him. The shepherd's ears angled slightly forward. Finch noticed the dog and chuckled lightly. "Impressive animal." "He works with me," Silas replied. Finch's smile widened. "Good. I always appreciate loyal partners." Silas gestured toward the porch. "What can I do for you?" Finch clasped his hands behind his back and turned slightly, surveying the land. "The view alone is worth the drive," he said. His voice carried the smooth confidence of a man used to negotiations. "Mr. Vale, we're conducting a geological survey of the surrounding mountains." Silas waited. Finch continued. "And it appears that the ridge your farmhouse sits on may be more valuable than anyone previously realized." Tom opened the briefcase and removed a folder. Silas noticed Brigg's body tense slightly. The dog's posture remained controlled, but his eyes never left Finch. Silas had seen that reaction before. Dogs noticed things about people that humans often ignored. Finch handed the folder over. Inside were maps, survey reports, highlighted sections of land. Silas recognized the boundaries immediately. They included his property. Finch folded his hands calmly. "We're prepared to make you an offer." Silas leaned against the porch railing. "How much?" Finch didn't hesitate. $800,000. The number hung in the air like a sudden thunderclap. Tom shifted slightly beside him, watching Silas carefully. The wind rustled the orchard branches. Silas looked down at the map again. $800,000. Enough money to rebuild the farmhouse 10 times over. Enough to disappear somewhere else entirely. Finch studied Silas's face. "You could move anywhere you like," Finch said. "Start fresh." Before Silas could respond, Brigg stepped forward. The German shepherd stood directly between Finch and the porch steps. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply stared. His amber eyes fixed on Finch with quiet intensity. For several seconds, the dog didn't move. Neither did Finch. The wind lifted the edge of Finch's coat. The man looked down at the dog and laughed softly. "Well," he said, "I suppose not everyone is convinced." But something about his voice had changed slightly. A faint crack beneath the polished confidence. Brigg blinked once, then he stepped back beside Silas again. The moment passed. But the air on the porch felt different afterward, like something unseen had briefly stepped into the conversation. Silas closed the folder. The pages rustled softly. He looked across the orchard. The land stretched quietly down toward the valley. Apple trees older than he was. The creek glimmering faintly in the distance. Walter Green's voice echoed in his mind. "You bought a place the town has been trying to forget." Silas looked back at Finch. "What happens to the land if you buy it?" he asked. Finch smiled again. "Mining operations," he said simply. "Nothing dramatic. Modern equipment. Controlled excavation." Silas's eyes drifted toward the mountains again. "And the town?" Finch shrugged slightly. "Economic growth," he said. "Jobs, development." Silas thought of the storm, of Owen cutting trees beside him, of Mara handing out bread at the market, of Ruth Alder's quiet house filled with books. He imagined trucks climbing North Ridge every day, explosions in the hills, dust clouds over the orchard. Finch watched him carefully. "You'd be foolish to refuse," Finch said gently. Silas nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. Finch's smile widened. "Then we understand each other." Silas handed the folder back. "I'm not selling." The wind shifted across the yard. Tom Rivers blinked behind his glasses. Finch remained still for several seconds. Then he sighed softly. "Well," he said, "that's disappointing." But his tone carried no anger, only patience, the patience of someone used to returning with better offers later. Finch buttoned his coat. "Think about it," he said. "We'll be in town for a few days." He nodded politely. "Good afternoon, Mr. Vale." The men returned to their vehicles. The engines started again. Within minutes, the SUVs disappeared down the dirt road toward Bright Hollow. Silas stood on the porch, watching the dust settle behind them. Brigg sat beside him, silent, loyal. Silas looked down at the dog. "You think that was the last time we see them?" Brigg tilted his head slightly. Silas laughed quietly. "Yeah," he said. "Me neither." The valley stretched out before them, calm and bright beneath the late afternoon sun. But somewhere beneath that quiet landscape, Silas knew something had shifted. The farmhouse was no longer just unfinished history. Now it was something else, something worth fighting for. The first snow of winter arrived quietly. It began sometime before dawn, drifting down in slow, patient flakes that settled across the orchard and the long grass beyond the farmhouse fence. By morning, North Ridge looked softer, the rough edges of broken branches and tire tracks gently hidden beneath a thin blanket of white. Silas Vale stepped onto the porch with a mug of black coffee warming his hands. The cold air carried the scent of pine and distant wood smoke from the valley below. Behind him, Brigg padded through the open door and sat beside the porch railing. The German shepherd watched the snowfall with calm, amber eyes. His thick coat caught flakes of snow along the black and gray fur of his back, while the harness with its dark straps and thin red trim rested firmly across his shoulders. Silas leaned against the railing. Bright Hollow lay quiet beneath the early winter sky. He thought about the offer again. $800,000. For a moment, the number returned like a ghost whispering in the back of his mind. Money could solve many problems, but not the kind he had carried home from war. He exhaled slowly. Brigg shifted slightly and rested his head against Silas's leg. Silas scratched behind the dog's ear. "You like it here, don't you?" Brigg's tail thumped once against the wooden boards. Silas smiled faintly. "So do I." Life in Bright Hollow changed gradually over the next few weeks. It began with small things. Owen Pike arrived first. The young mechanic drove up the ridge one morning with a battered pickup full of lumber tied down with thick rope. Owen climbed out of the truck wearing the same red and black flannel jacket he seemed to wear every day of his life. His hair stuck out beneath a gray wool cap, and his beard had grown rough from several days of winter work. He scratched the back of his neck when he saw Silas. "Figured that roof might need help," he said. Silas studied him for a moment. "Appreciate it." Owen shrugged. "Town doesn't usually let people freeze on a mountain." The two men spent the day reinforcing the barn roof and replacing loose boards along the fence line. Brig followed them quietly through the yard, occasionally carrying dropped tools in his mouth with the proud seriousness of a working dog. Later that week, Mara Bell arrived. She walked up the path with a woven basket balanced on one arm. Mara was taller than most women in town, her posture straight and confident, despite the winter wind tugging at the hem of her coat. Her honey-brown hair was pulled into a loose braid that rested over one shoulder, strands escaping around her temples. Her eyes carried the same sharp intelligence Silas had noticed the first time they met. Inside the basket were loaves of fresh bread. "Town tradition," she said, "for stubborn newcomers." Silas raised an eyebrow. "Stubborn?" Mara smiled. "You turned down $800,000. Silas chuckled quietly. "Word travels fast." "Small towns," she said. "Everything travels fast." More people began to visit. Sheriff Bill Henderson arrived with spare fencing wire and a toolbox. The sheriff was a large man in his late 50s with broad shoulders and thick silver hair beneath his hat. Years of working in mountain weather had carved deep lines around his mouth and eyes, but his expression carried a steady warmth that people in Bright Hollow trusted. Bill leaned against the porch railing one afternoon. "Town's talking about you," he said. Silas glanced over. "That good or bad?" Bill shrugged. "Depends who you ask." But his smile suggested the answer had shifted. One evening near sunset, Brig began acting strangely. The German shepherd stood near the orchard fence, staring toward the valley below. Not barking, not moving, just watching. Silas stepped outside and followed the dog's gaze. At first he saw nothing unusual, just snow-covered fields and the distant lights of Bright Hollow flickering on as evening settled across the valley. Then Brig lifted his head slightly. His ears twitched, and for a brief moment Silas thought he heard something carried on the wind. Not a voice. Not exactly. More like distant music. A soft, hollow sound drifting from somewhere far below the ridge. Silas frowned slightly. "Probably the wind through the trees," he murmured. Brig remained still for another moment. Then the dog relaxed and trotted back toward the porch, as if whatever he had sensed was no longer important. Silas stood alone at the fence, watching the valley lights. Something about the moment stayed with him long after the sound faded. Winter settled deeper into the mountains. Snowstorms came and went, but life on North Ridge continued. Silas repaired the farmhouse piece by piece. He rebuilt the old barn doors, reinforced the foundation stones beneath the porch, cleared fallen branches from the orchard rows. Through it all, Brig remained his constant companion. The dog moved through the property like a silent guardian, watching every approaching vehicle, every stranger walking up the path. And gradually, the visits from town became something else. Not curiosity, not suspicion. Community. Owen began stopping by twice a week to help with repairs. Mara delivered supplies whenever the roads grew difficult. Bill occasionally drove up just to sit on the porch and talk about weather, hunting seasons, or old stories from the mountains. Even Walter Green appeared once more. The old ranger climbed slowly up the porch steps one afternoon, leaning on his cane as he studied the farmhouse with quiet approval. "You're bringing it back," Walter said. Silas wiped sawdust from his hands. "Trying to." Walter nodded. "That house needed someone stubborn." Silas laughed softly. "I've heard that before." Walter looked out across the orchard. "For what it's worth," he added quietly, "the town's glad you stayed." Spring arrived slowly. The snow melted from the valley floor, revealing dark soil and the first pale shoots of grass pushing through the thawing ground. One morning, Silas stood beside the orchard fence again. But the air felt different now. Warmer. Alive. Brig trotted across the field chasing a drifting leaf, his tail wagging in wide arcs as sunlight flashed across the shepherd's coat. Silas watched the dog run. He thought about the war, the years drifting from one place to another, the silence that had followed him home. Bright Hollow had changed that. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just little pieces at a time, like rebuilding a broken house. Behind him, the farmhouse door creaked open. Owen stepped onto the porch carrying a hammer. Mara followed with another basket of supplies. Bill's truck rolled slowly up the dirt road behind them. Silas smiled. The valley stretched wide beneath the morning sun. For the first time in a long time, he felt something settle deep in his chest. Not restlessness, not regret. Something steadier. Belonging. Brig ran back toward him and sat beside the fence. Silas rested a hand on the dog's head. "You did good, partner." The German shepherd leaned lightly against his leg. Together they looked out across the valley. The farmhouse stood behind them. The town waited below. And the land, quiet, patient, and enduring, seemed to remember everything that had come before. But now, it held something new. A future worth protecting. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in the form of a second chance, a loyal companion walking beside you, or a place that reminds a tired heart how to belong again. In Silas's story, the miracle was not money, nor fame, nor power. The miracle was something much simpler and much deeper. It was the moment a broken man chose to protect something good instead of walking away from it. It was a loyal dog who sensed what words could not explain. It was a small town learning how to open its heart again. And perhaps most of all, it was the quiet reminder that God often works in ways we do not expect. In our everyday lives, we may feel lost, tired, or unseen. We may believe that nothing around us is changing. But sometimes God is already at work in the background, guiding us to the right people, the right place, and the right moment to begin again. Maybe your miracle will not look dramatic. Maybe it will be a new opportunity, a helping hand, a loyal friend, or the courage to stand for what is right when it would be easier to walk away. But those moments matter more than we realize. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story stayed with you the most. And if you believe in stories that remind us of faith, courage, and second chances, please consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May God watch over you, guide your path, and bless you and your family with peace, strength, and quiet miracles in your daily life.